Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbart Gaming. It's been a little while since I've done a hardware review. Why? Well, frankly, for the last few years, most of the devices that have come out, especially in the handheld space, have been real similar to each other, with many using the same hardware in a different shell. But over the last 6 months or so, new stuff with new hardware has finally started showing up, so I plan to get back on that hardware reviewing horse right now. Today I'll be doing an in-depth review of the Retroid Pocket Flip. And there's a lot to cover here, so I won't waste any more of your precious time. Let's just jump right into it. First off, let's take a look at the overall build quality of this Pocket Flip. I've gotta say, it was a tad smaller than I expected. It's not as wide as some other portable consoles, mainly owing to the slightly smaller screen. It's also a bit of a chunky boy. This thing is thick. The rounded edges are nice enough to hold though. When it comes to quality, it feels pretty good overall. The device retails for about $160 right now, with approximately $15 shipping to the US. And yeah, that price is just shy of what more premium and powerful Android handheld devices go for, so that may be a turnoff to some of you. The screen of the Flip is gorgeous despite its lower resolution. I was really impressed with it. It looks nicer than a lot of mid-range phones I've seen that are a lot more expensive. The color temperature was set a little too warm by default, but you can go in and adjust that easily enough, which I did. And the picture quality is just fine after making that very slight, fast tweak. I really like that they built a fan into this unit also. It helped me record footage for this video today. How did a fan help me do that? You see, the Flip doesn't get too hot by itself when you're just playing it under normal circumstances. But when you're playing it while it's charging, it gets really warm. Uncomfortably warm even. But enabling the fan completely prevents that and brings it back into the comfort zone and heads off any heat-related throttling. You control the fan with a simple on or off setting in Android itself. And one of the main features of this device is the fact that it flips open like a Nintendo DS or 3DS. The hinge on the Flip is a little weird if you're used to Nintendo's handhelds. You might find the hinge on the Flip a little mushy and just odd because it doesn't snap into place like Nintendo's handhelds do. And I've got to say, it's really kind of unpleasant. And while flipped open, it's a little too close to the L&R bumpers with the angle that you're on. The biggest grievance I have with the design, however, has to be the placement of the speaker, which is on the bottom of the unit. I mean, come on guys, you've got practically nothing at all on the front of this thing on the base. Surely you could have fit the speakers in the base so they fired up instead of down. Here's a special message to any hardware manufacturer thinking about making a new device with bottom-firing speakers.
Stop it! Stop it!
Anyway, the buttons and analog sliders all feel pretty good. The sliders even have an L3 and R3 click. If you're used to the 3DS, you should have no problem adjusting to using these sliders instead of an analog stick for games that use them. The only real problem I have with the sliders is their placement. They're too close to the center of the base, forcing you to have to reach pretty far to use them. If they were each moved about a ½ inch closer to the outside edge of the device, they would have felt way better. Now the D-pad is unfortunately kind of on the meh side of the spectrum. Because of its placement and the cramped nature of this unit, sometimes it misses presses when you're trying to slide your thumb from one side to the other. I've had many a frustrating game of Tetris because of it. It makes playing that game at higher speeds way harder than it should be. Also, the D-pad on my unit sometimes makes an audible creaking sound when pressed down and moved around. In the end, the D-pad is okay. I mean, I've seen worse, it's not terrible or anything, but I was definitely hoping it would be a little better than it is. And then let's talk again about all that negative space between the D-pad and buttons for a moment. You know what would have been nice here? Well, other than maybe speakers? How about hardware Android navigation buttons like other similar devices have? I had to turn on the navigation buttons on screen because gestures just weren't working right for me on the Flip. Having buttons on the unit would have prevented that. And now, a word of caution. By default, the button layout on the Flip is set to retro mode. This means the buttons match the labels and are set up Nintendo style with YX and BA instead of X input style, which is XY AB. By default, apps will work in retro mode and set your buttons by their label instead of their position, which is frankly kind of disastrous. Now thankfully you can change this setting to Xbox mode, which is how it should have come by default. All you have to do is go into settings, then handheld, and change the setting there. And honestly, it should be the very first thing you do when you get this and power it on. As far as some neat extra features, the Flip has an extra set of shoulder buttons that are actually recognized by pretty much every app I've tried. This is awesome for stuff like DS and 3DS because you can map things like swapping screens and screen modes onto them without sacrificing a main button or having to go into a menu to make that change. Also, the micro HDMI out port sure was handy for me at least. I probably won't normally ever hook this thing up to a TV, but I hooked it up to a USB capture device for all my recording for this video, and you'll be looking at all that in just a moment here. Now really, this is something all of these devices should have. As of now, some do, some don't. You'll also get a button mapping application right from the start, which will be useful for touchscreen Android games. Button mapping applications are pretty standard for devices to this type, but still, it's good to know that it's in there right from the get-go. Finally, the USB-C port on the back of the unit can be used for both charging and data transfer, and you also get 128 gigabytes of storage built into the unit, and you can also add a micro SD card. The micro SD mechanism is a little wonky, at least in my unit, and I had a card kinda get stuck, so they could have definitely designed that a little better, but at least it works. Okay, so next up, here's a lot of footage I recorded from the Flip's micro HDMI out port. I'll begin this section by showing you a montage of games from older systems. I won't waste a lot of time on these, since you can expect anything from the 16-bit era and below to work just fine on the Flip. After a couple of minutes of proving that, I'll jump into more powerful systems and tell you about how they run and how they perform. Alrighty, so now let's take a look at what have traditionally been the problem areas with these types of portable systems, the 32-bit generation and beyond. Most systems like this these days can handle PlayStation emulation without issue, and as you can see here, the Flip does that as well. I tried a few games, I didn't throw a ton of them at it, but I made sure to try the gamut, some 2D games, some 3D, some that have a reputation for being hard to run, and I didn't find any that didn't work or that had any problems. I can't promise compatibility is 100% on any emulator, so you'll always want to check before buying a unit like this to make sure it'll run your favorite game on your emulator of choice. But I can at least tell you that I didn't run into any issues with the several PlayStation games that I tested. Now, Sega Saturn, on the other hand, is often kind of tough to get running on cheaper Android systems, and that holds true on the Flip. If you're using RetroArch, you won't get anywhere near full speed out of Beetle Saturn on this device. It just is not capable of it. Games typically run about half the speed they do on real hardware through that emulator. Now, you can run stuff on Yaba Sanshiro instead, but you'll butt up against compatibility issues and glitches if you make that your primary Saturn emulator, as you can see here. It's disappointing since Saturn emulation has gotten better these days, but on Android, unless you have a really powerful device, you're kind of where Windows-based PCs were like 5 years ago when it comes to Saturn emulation. Bottom line, don't buy a Flip to play Saturn games, it's not good at it. You'll find a few that you can probably run okay, but for the most part, lots of games will still have issues on Yaba Sanshiro. Now the picture is a little rosier when it comes to Sega's final major console, the Dreamcast. You've got a few decent emulators to choose from, including standalone ones or RetroArch cores. Now Redream runs pretty well, but it definitely isn't flawless. I did notice some frame drops here and there while testing a few different games on it. You can also use Flycast and RetroArch, which in general is a smidge less compatible, but may handle some games better for you than Redream does. Now again, I wouldn't buy a Flip just for the express purpose of playing Dreamcast games on the go. It's not quite perfect. But if you just want to mess around with DC stuff here and there, you'll probably be happy enough with it. Lots of games run well, and there's a few oddballs that don't. PSP emulation has generally been pretty good even on weaker hardware, thanks to the pure awesomeness that is PPSSPP. This emulator continues to amaze with its performance even on lower-end hardware. Some of the games you're seeing in this segment, like Tomb Raider Anniversary and Wipeout, used to bring weaker hardware to its knees, which you can actually see if you look at some of my older hardware review videos from just a couple of years ago. On the Flip, you can run these games now at 3 times resolution and seemingly never even drop a frame. If you love PSP games and want to play them on a more modern portable device at higher resolutions with save states and extra benefits like that, then yeah, the Flip is great for these. I didn't find any in the batch of several games I tried that had any kinds of issues at all. But again, your mileage may vary depending on the specific game you want to play. But overall, PSP runs great on the Flip. Alright, now this one is kind of a surprise. After seeing the trouble with Saturn emulation and less than perfect Dreamcast emulation, I expected that PlayStation 2 emulation was going to be a strict no-go on the Flip. And for some games, like Shadow of the Colossus here and Gran Turismo 4, well, that's absolutely true. But then, you have some other games like Gradius 5, Castlevania Lament of Innocence, even Dragon Quest V here and some others that run surprisingly well. I was actually pretty impressed by some of the performance Aether SX2 managed to squeeze out of this thing. So this is a case where you'll absolutely need to check and see if the game you want to play works well before making a decision to buy a Flip to play it on the go, since it's incredibly hit and miss. But I do have to say, I was impressed and happy to see that some games perform really, really well. This was by far the biggest surprise I had while recording this footage. Now, N64 emulation can be a little tricky on some devices, even these days, but this was another case where all the games I tested on the Flip ran just fine. I mostly used a standalone version of Mupen, and I didn't run into any performance issues with any of the games that I tried. Now again, emulation performance on the N64 can vary a lot by the game and the graphics cores and CPU cores you're using, so it's possible there will be some that don't run as well as what you're seeing here, but at least I didn't encounter any of that in my time testing these things out for the system. So N64 emulation looks like it's about as good as you're going to get on a portable device on the Flip. Now, contrary to my good surprise with PS2 emulation, I'm quite disappointed in GameCube and Wii emulation performance on the Flip. Now, I tried about 4 different versions of Dolphin, including MMJR3, and most of the GameCube games I tested failed to run at full speed even after extensive tweaking in the emulator options. Some of the games just choked hardcore, falling into single-digit FPS for a while. I didn't expect many GameCube games to run at full speed, but honestly, I did expect way better performance out of the Flip than I got here. You'll find a few games that run close to full speed, but probably not all that many from my experience, unless I just happened to try a batch of games that were especially hard to emulate. Here's a spoiler alert on that, I didn't. To me, this is by far the biggest letdown on this unit emulation-wise. Definitely don't even consider picking up a Flip for yourself if GameCube emulation is something that you need to have. It just does not handle it well. And then obviously the situation on Wii will be about the same since Dolphin is used to emulate both GameCube and Wii games, which, everything I said about the GameCube basically holds true here. But like you'll find a few GameCube games that run at just about full speed, you'll find a few Wii games here and there that run at near full speed also. Here's Chocobo's Mystery Dungeon, and it runs pretty well on most low-spec hardware I've tested it on, and as you can see, it runs pretty well here also. Now, this is a 30 frames per second game when run on actual Wii hardware, unlike the newer ports for systems like the Switch and PS4 that run at 60 frames per second. So what you're seeing on the Flip right now is basically full-speed emulation. And you will come across a few other games, like some of the Fire Emblem games on the GameCube and Wii, that do run at just about full speed. So there'll be some, but not nearly as many as you would have hoped. Nintendo DS emulation with Drastic is pretty great even on lower-end hardware. Drastic still has a few bugs and it isn't perfect, and it also isn't free. But if you weren't aware, you can just sign up for Google Opinion Rewards, do a few surveys, and after a while you'll have enough Play Store credit to buy Drastic or any other cheap apps in no time. I'm not going to show you a ton of DS emulation here, because DS games basically all run just fine for my testing, including when you increase the resolution of the polygonal games. But running Drastic isn't all that impressive, it's expected. But at least we can say the Flip didn't let us down here, right? Good job, Flip. So next up, we have the Nintendo 3DS. My expectations for Citra on the Flip were in the basement after seeing how some of the other systems ran on this thing. And pretty much every game I tried did have lots of issues. There's stuttering, shader compilation delays, and all the sort of stuff you'd probably expect here. But I found several games that are actually pretty playable, despite a few minor annoyances. Again, I wouldn't buy a Flip with the express purpose of playing Citra, but if you're lucky, it might actually handle some of the games that you like pretty well. But for the games that it doesn't handle well, yeah, there are many that are just completely unplayable. So I wouldn't even really term this as disappointing, since I didn't expect it to run well, since Citra has pretty high requirements for smooth emulation, and yeah, I mean, it was exactly what I expected. And finally, not pictured here, you can even run some Nintendo Switch games on the Flip with the recently discontinued Skyline emulator. I'm not going to show you any Switch emulation up and running on this thing, because that's asking for trouble on YouTube these days. What I will tell you is the few games I tested actually ran pretty well, some of them even at full speed. But I also experienced crashes where the app would just suddenly close without any warning. So there are no games I tested that actually worked right and that I would deem fully playable. Still, it was interesting seeing a few Switch games up and running on this thing, especially with performance better than I would have expected. Okay, so you just saw the culmination of about, 15 hours of game footage whittled down to a few minutes. What more can I tell you after spending a week or so with the Retroid Pocket Flip, and what's my final review score? Well, prepare yourself for the thrilling conclusion to this video right now. First off, let me say, I'm glad after about 2.5 years, we're finally seeing a much bigger variety of Android and portable gaming hardware. For the last couple of years, lots of systems were powered by the same cheap chips that were in the Odroid Go Advance, and it was really tiresome seeing one new device after another announced with the exact same hardware. The Flip and other devices from the last 6 months or so are finally based on different and in some cases considerably more powerful SoCs, or systems on a chip. What's crazy though is many devices still aren't as powerful as the GPD XD I picked up at launch years ago. Anyway, back to the Flip itself. So to sum up, from a design standpoint, the Flip is alright, but it has a few obvious flaws. I mentioned those at the top of the video. It's a little cramped, the analog sliders are way too close to the center of the base, it has that bottom firing speaker, a D-pad that's just okay, and a lot of unused space on the base of the unit. Now looking back at the GPD XD I just mentioned, it was way more comfortable to hold and use, even though its design was pretty much completely stolen from the 3DS XL. The XD was comfortable to hold and use for long periods of time. The Flip really isn't, it's just too cramped. And it's okay for a while, but when playing any games that use the analog sliders, it makes my hand hurt after a while for stretching so far to reach the sticks, or sliders. Oh, and I've noticed it's really hard to keep moving in a straight line with the analog sliders on this device, which led to some problems like you saw in my Theater Rhythm curtain call footage on Citra. Sometimes it just missed the inputs, other times it misread them as going on a different angle than I actually pressed. Along the same lines, the position and angle of the D-pad on the Flip really strains my thumb after a while for games that exclusively use the D-pad. And another D-pad issue I should mention is that it tends to detect upward presses when you're moving straight left or right. I mean, it's kind of hard, again, to keep characters moving in a straight line sometimes, and this was especially obvious when I was testing out Ghouls and Ghosts on the Super Graphics, since Arthur just stops dead in his tracks when you hit a diagonal. So this thing was registering diagonals when I wasn't even slightly leaning upwards. Now, that's the bad stuff. There are plenty of positives with the Flip too. It's got that great screen that I raved about a little earlier. It's running a newer version of Android 11 in this case, and there's lots of options, including some specific to this device. We have micro HDMI out, a headphone jack, USB-C charging, along with some extra assignable buttons. Any games from the 16-bit era and below will run just perfectly, but they'll also run perfectly on devices that cost half what the Flip is going for. Frankly, I'm disappointed that it isn't a little more powerful at the current $165 asking price. Some of the competition that's only about $25 or $30 more is significantly more capable. In the end, I feel like the Flip is a nice little machine that could have used a little more time in the oven and really should have cost a good, let's say $40 less than it does. If the Flip went for about $120 or so, I could easily recommend it despite its foibles and deficiencies. But after shipping, this is right at about $180, and frankly, you shouldn't spend that much on it. There are other more powerful devices you can buy. You might even be better off just getting one of those $30 or $40 controllers that encloses your phone and basically turns it into a dedicated gaming device. So the Retroid Pocket Flip, it's getting lots of online love right now, and frankly, I don't quite get it. It's good, but it's a ways off from great. In the end, with all of its little issues, its high price, and its mediocre performance, I can't, in good conscience, rate this device any higher than a 6 out of 10. If you get one, you'll have fun with it, but you could run the same games on much cheaper hardware, and you can run more games on just slightly more expensive hardware. That leaves the Flip in a weird middle ground, where it'll leave you wishing it was either cheaper, more powerful, or maybe even both. So what do you think? Do you have a Flip? Do you love it? Are you already angrily banging away on your keyboard typing a comment calling me stupid? Just let it all out. But seriously, tell me what you think and what your favorite current indie handheld gaming device is these days in the comments. And that'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed it, please toss it a like and share it. If you haven't yet, please subscribe and hit that notification bell so you'll know when my next video comes out. If you want to support the work I do here, you can now become a channel member on YouTube or support me on Patreon or Ko-fi with links to follow, and also they're down below in the description. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.